You have heard about the band that kept playing. You have heard about Captain Smith going down with his ship. Tonight, we are not telling that story. Tonight, we tell the story of the 885 people you have never heard of. The ones who actually made the Titanic run. Building her took 3 years and the labor of over 3,000 shipyard workers in Belfast. Before she ever carried a single passenger or crew member to sea. From the boiler rooms in her belly to the kitchens and cabins above, this was a floating factory, not a hotel. And the job you were given decided almost everything, including whether you lived. Tonight, the stokers who shoveled hundreds of tons of coal a day, the stewards who served 4 different classes of passengers, the bakers, the engineers who never came back up. This is what their lives on the Titanic actually looked like. And what it paid. We start at the very bottom of the ship, 3 decks below the waterline, in a place passengers never saw. The Stokehold. Down here, temperatures topped 120 degrees. Firemen shoveled coal into the furnaces. Trimmers wheeled it in from the bunkers, and greasers kept the machinery from seizing. All of it by lamplight, breathing coal dust. Shifts ran on a rhythm called 4 on, 8 off. 4 hours shoveling in the heat, 8 hours to eat, wash, and sleep before the next watch began. Around the clock for the entire 6-day crossing. For that work, a fireman earned about £6 a month, among the lowest wages on the ship, and barely enough to support a family ashore. Off duty, they slept in cramped, shared bunks near the bow, the worst berths on the ship, as far from the machinery as they could get, but never far enough to escape the noise. A trimmer could work his way up to fireman, and a fireman up to leading fireman, for a few more shillings a month. One of the only paths upward on a ship, where most jobs came with no path at all. Their work kept the Titanic moving at over 20 knots, burning through 600 to 850 tons of coal a day. Enough coal, shoveled entirely by hand, to fill a line of carts stretching for miles. 1 deck above the stokehold, in a quieter, better-lit room, worked the men who kept the whole machine from tearing itself apart. 25 ship's engineers and 8 electricians ran the turbines, the dynamos, and the pumps. Men with formal technical training, ranked as officers, not laborers. The same engineers also ran the refrigeration plants, keeping tons of fresh meat, fish, and dairy cold for the entire crossing. One more system that had to work perfectly every hour, or spoil the passengers' dinner along with it. Their pay was better than a fireman's, and their work was cleaner. But their responsibility was total. If the pumps failed, the whole ship failed with them. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, every one of those 25 engineers and 8 electricians stayed at their posts. Not one of them survived, nor did either of the ship's 2 boilermakers. For over 2 hours, the pumps fought to keep pace with water flooding in through 6 ruptured compartments. A fight the ship's design was never built to win. That story, that they stayed to keep the lights burning until the very end, is a memorial account passed down afterward. No one who was with them lived to confirm it firsthand. 2 decks below the waterline, in a small mailroom, 5 postal clerks sorted the ship's cargo of registered mail. Over 200 bags of it, carried on contract for the Royal Mail and the U.S. Post Office. Among the sacks they carried were insured parcels, bank documents, and ordinary letters. Cargo that, for 5 men, became the reason they stayed below as the water rose. None of the 5 survived. Not one of their bodies was ever found, though postal historians still remember their names today. 5 men who had never met before this one voyage. Above the engine room, up where daylight actually reached, worked a very different kind of crew. The deck department, able seamen, quartermasters, and lookouts, the men who actually sailed the ship. Crew meals were nothing like the passengers. Sailors and firemen ate in a shared mess. Tea, bread, boiled meat, filling, plain, and the same every day. First-class passengers, 2 decks up, were served 11 courses that same evening, prepared by the same kitchen staff who would eat what was left over if anything was left at all. An able seaman earned around £5 a month, working the ropes, the lifeboats, and the wheel in rotating watches, day and night, in all weather. 2 of them stood watch in the crow's nest that night with no binoculars. A supply oversight from before the ship ever left port, not a warning ignored. Scanning a flat, moonless sea for ice. Quartermaster Robert Hitchens was at the wheel when the order came, hard a starboard. He turned it as fast as the ship's wheel would go. It was not fast enough. What followed decided quietly and unevenly who on this ship would still be alive by morning. Quartermasters, 1 step up from able seamen, steered the ship itself and answered directly to the officers on the bridge. a job that paid a little more and mattered even more when it counted. Above the sailors stood the ship's officers, men who had spent years earning a master's certificate before they ever set foot on a liner like this one. Two ships' surgeons treated crew and steerage passengers for the voyage's minor injuries and illnesses. Neither of them survived the sinking either. A junior officer might earn 10 to 15 pounds a month. The captain, Edward Smith, was paid roughly 105 pounds a month, the best paid man aboard, and the only one whose name any passenger actually knew. One profession on board didn't belong to White Star Line at all. The two wireless operators worked for the Marconi company, sending paid telegrams for passengers, and, that night, receiving ice warnings from other ships. Whether every warning reached the bridge in time or was set aside behind a stack of paying passengers' telegrams is something historians still argue about. The senior operator, Jack Phillips, kept sending the distress call, first the older signal, then the newer one, SOS, one of the first ships ever to use it, until the power finally failed beneath him. He stayed at the key long after the captain released him from duty. Phillips did not survive the night. 600 miles away, a wireless operator aboard the Carpathia caught the signal just before going to bed. Staying at his post a few minutes longer helped bring rescue to more than 700 people. For 1912, she was extraordinary. Electric lights in every corridor, 4 elevators, her own newspaper printed daily on board. All of it kept running by the same power plant the engineers guarded below. At just over 46,000 tons, she was the largest moving object built by human hands to that date. The ship stretched longer than 3 city blocks and carried over 3,000 people when full. Yet only 20 lifeboats, enough for about half of them. That night, it was able seamen and junior officers who loaded and lowered those lifeboats, deciding, boat by boat, who got a seat and who did not. But not every job on board was about survival at all. Some existed purely to make first class feel like it had never left dry land. A gymnasium instructor ran daily fitness classes on an electric horse and a rowing machine. For passengers only, never for crew. A Turkish bath and heated swimming pool employed their own dedicated attendants, open on a strict schedule, first class only. One of the only such amenities at sea in 1912. A regulation squash court sat just below the waterline too, staffed by its own professional. A game reserved entirely for first-class men. The lift boys, some barely out of their teens, operated the ship's 4 elevators by hand all shift for a wage lower than a deckhand's. And in a small office near the purser's cabin, clerks kept track of the real money on board, passengers' valuables, locked in a safe, logged item by item, ticket by ticket. A first-class ticket that season cost many times more than a fireman would earn in a year of shoveling coal. On the very same ship, at the very same time. But none of that mattered without the 400 people actually keeping everyone fed, clean, and comfortable. Roughly 400 men and women, more than any other department, existed for one purpose: to make 3,000 people forget they were on a ship at all. 322 stewards covered more than 50 separate jobs, split strictly by class. A third-class steward and a first-class steward never crossed paths in the same corridor. A steward's wage depended entirely on which class he served. A first-class steward could earn more in tips on a single crossing than a fireman earned in a month. But he was expected to be invisible, on call around the clock. Below them, in the galleys, cooks and bakers worked shifts that never really ended, producing separate menus for 4 different classes from a single kitchen. The bakery alone produced fresh bread daily for over 2,000 people, using ovens that, like everything else on board, ran on the same coal the firemen shoveled 3 decks down. In third class, dinner was simpler: soup, meat, potatoes, and bread. Served promptly and cleared quickly, not far in spirit from what the crew themselves were eating below. At the very bottom of that department were the scullions, teenage boys washing dishes and scrubbing pots for hours on end. The lowest paid job on the entire ship. 23 stewardesses worked the crossing too, assigned mostly to first and second class women and children. One of the only jobs on the entire ship reserved for women. A ship's laundry ran almost continuously, washing linens and uniforms for over 3,000 people, staffed by crew whose names rarely appear in any passenger's memory. Even the barbershop sold souvenirs, ribbon and postcards stamped with the ship's name. A small side income for a barber who, like everyone else aboard, was paid to make the voyage feel ordinary. Most of these jobs were filled by men from Southampton alone, entire streets emptied of husbands and sons when the Titanic signed her crew, just days before departure. Every single one of these people, from the captain to the scullery boy, shared one thing in common the night the ship went down. The moment the Titanic sank, White Star Line stopped paying every crew member's wages instantly. Not injured leave, not compensation. Payroll simply ended when the ship did. White Star Line had called her unsinkable in its own advertising. The men and women who kept her running were never asked whether they believed it. And that same ledger tells you something else, something crueler than the pay. Look at who actually survived, department by department, and a pattern appears that has nothing to do with courage. Roughly 40 of the 280 engineering department men survived. Most stewards on the upper decks had a far better chance, not because they were braver, but because of where their job put them the moment the ship started to sink. Officers on watch that night had one advantage no fireman or steward shared. They were already standing on the boat deck when the order to load the lifeboats came. Of the roughly 885 crew aboard, historians estimate around 7 in 10 never came home. A heavier toll, department for department, than most of the passengers they served. Most of their names never made it into a single history book. Their families got a final wage packet and nothing else. The band kept playing. Captain Smith went down with his ship. But for 885 ordinary crew members, survival came down to something much simpler. Which deck your job put you on. If you want to see how the rest of history really paid for itself, like and subscribe, and keep watching the next video on screen now.